This is the IBJ podcast for the week of June the 3rd, 2019. I'm Mason King.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Well, that, of course, was HAL 3000 in 2001, A Space Odyssey. I think we could say that that is a worst-case scenario for artificial intelligence. And it speaks to some of our anxiety, I think, as most science fiction does, about designing machines that can think for themselves, at least in terms of learning and problem solving. Now, we hear a lot of scary predictions about the potential for artificial intelligence at the same time that we hear what a boon it is for industries like healthcare, financial services, marketing, logistics, and even agriculture. It's possible that you're listening to this podcast on your Alexa or Cortana, which use AI-based algorithms to study your purchasing habits and lifestyles. Artificial intelligence is the main subject of this year's edition of IBJ's Innovation Issue. And the innovation issue is the main subject of our podcast today. Not just what we've learned about AI, but why we do an innovation issue in the first place. Now, the first innovation issue was in 2015, and the approach was to spread a wide net. The lead story, for example, unpacked all the different things that innovation means for businesses, and we used examples from 10 companies in central Indiana. It also looked back at innovative products created in Indiana over 150 years. But like AI and everything else that we write about, it has evolved fairly quickly. And with me in the podcast studio to talk about this is IBJ Managing Editor Lesley Weidenbener. Lesley?
Thanks for having me, Mason.
Sure. The name might sound familiar for really any one of 100 reasons, but you might recall she also is the editor of the IBJ podcast and will have the out-of-body experience of editing herself.
I know. I'm not looking forward to that.
And also in the studio is Anthony Schoettle, IBJ's technology reporter. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
So, Lesley, let's first point out that the innovation issue is unusual
for
the IBJ. Why is that?
Well, we call it a takeover of the issue. Essentially, we don't put out our regular issue. All the normal things that you would find in IBJ are gone for this issue. We replace it entirely with the subject at hand, which is innovation.
Why innovation? Isn't our job all year round to find innovative companies and initiatives and write about them?
I think that is precisely why we stop and do an innovation issue. You know, every company we talk to is trying to be more innovative. Everybody is looking for the answer to the question of how to be more innovative, how to create an innovative culture. And it is a part of what we do all the time. But really, this is an opportunity to stop and take a much deeper dive into what it means to be innovative and how that can be a lot of different things. You know, it's easy to think of innovation as a technology thing, but actually innovation is about far more than that. It's really about a way of thinking. And what we try to do with the innovation issue is look across that spectrum of different ideas and different ways in which people can be innovative.
Do some people complain about the issue?
We definitely get some complaints from people who don't like that we take over the paper, that we don't have our normal roster of regular features. We do. I said we entirely take it over. We do actually have one thing that we keep every year, which is our briefs. It's called On the Record. Our On the Record page stays so that we can get in a little bit of the news that happened for the week. But yes, we usually do have a few complaints. Fortunately, this year and most years it falls right around Memorial Day, which is at least when there's not as much news happening. So that helps.
Now, to disabuse anybody of the notion that we just throw this together in a week, tell me a little bit about the planning process.
So we start planning for this usually in February or March. We actually talk to lots of people out in the community. We have meetings with people who try to foster innovation, with design thinkers or with people who are doing interesting things, and we ask them where the stories are. Then we put together a roster of stories. We also, even before that, we're sort of thinking about what our theme may be. The last few years, we've had themes around our innovation issue. Last year, blockchain was, and Anthony, You'll probably remember Anthony wrote a big story about cryptocurrencies. Last year, one of our themes was also virtual reality. The year before that, our theme was the Internet of Things. And, that it was a great opportunity to take what was then really an emerging technology, emerging terms, and explain them to people. And that's what we felt like we were doing last year with blockchain. And then, of course, this year's artificial intelligence.
Okay, well, help me out. So the first thing we really have to do is define this. When I think about artificial intelligence, I think about a computer that thinks like a person and is trying to kill me, or eventually will try to kill me. That's because I watch too many movies. What is the better way to describe and explain artificial intelligence?
One of the first panels on this type of technology was labeled to be talking about thinking machines. And I think that's one practical way to think about artificial intelligence, thinking machines. And in 1956, a computer scientist and professor came up with the term artificial intelligence. And the term has led to a lot of confusion because the neural networks today that are operating digitally operate very much like a human mind. I mean, there's nothing really artificial about it other than it's not human. So really, I think the term that will become more ubiquitous will be machine intelligence versus human intelligence, because that's really the only difference. And that is the big leap in technology in the last 5 years, is that these neural networks have been able to act a lot more like a human brain. So AI you can break down into really two very broad categories. Kind of the initial wave of AI was computer software that could learn when humans started it with a data set. The newer wave of AI and the really, really promising wave of AI that's coming out and will come out in the years to come are computer programs. That's what algorithms are. Computer programs that can learn by themselves without any human intervention from the very start. So very much like an infant. And the computer takes in information on its own and learns from that information. The applications are extremely broad. Now, the scary part, I think, the reason that people get frightened of AI are a few things. One is there's a belief that it's going to take a lot of jobs, and it's going to take some jobs. And depending on who you talk to, it could take a lot of more of the manual labor jobs and low-level jobs. Eventually, I think that robots and that could do a lot of what humans do, but we're not there with robotics yet. We don't have technology for robots to learn and understand balance, mobility the way that a human can, obviously, but they don't understand cultural cues. And also, there's a real scare because robots can learn biases. And Amazon had their AI program where they were finding job candidates, or they had took years to develop an AI program to essentially take data from job candidates and decide who the best job candidates were. And relatively quickly, the AI-assisted program began biasing against women. And so, these are, very real concerns about the technology going forward.
One of the things that we did for the innovation issue was talk to an ethicist at Butler University who got really interested in this topic because of his interest in science fiction. But he talked a lot about that, and in particular, how easy it is to introduce bias into AI because of data sets, that inherently almost every data set has some kind of bias because of however it was collected.
One of the big problems with AI right now is that it excels in situations with limited parameters. And you've probably seen computers play chess, and they're much better than humans, for the most part, at playing chess, checkers, backgammon. They're very good at Jeopardy, for instance. We've seen that recently. But
Not this new guy.
Yeah.
I want to see Watson against the new guy.
Yeah, but the computer has been overwhelmingly better than the best Jeopardy players so far. And even, to bring this into, even a little finer context, and to kind of help people understand what AI is, because it's not all that easy to understand what it is. The University of North Carolina used artificial intelligence-driven software to diagnose cancer patients. They did so alongside of a doctor, and 90-some-odd% of the time they came up with the same diagnosis as the physician. The scary part is because the computer could work so much faster that it brought 30% more data to the decision-making process than the physician could, and it came up with a lot of diagnoses that the physicians had missed. And so this is just another example of how more closely with each passing week, month, and year that AI is mirroring what humans can do.
Research has shown that there's a tremendous amount of promise in using AI in healthcare, but we have another story in the issue about healthcare specifically where everything is very promising, but the real world applications are still being worked out.
And there is, and not always will be, I think, a bit of a social stigma to being diagnosed by a computer. And there's a real trust issue there that may never be squared, quite frankly. I don't know, you want your diagnosis coming from a computer? Maybe someday we'll be comfortable with that. I don't think we're there yet.
Wouldn't there also be, and I think you may also bring this up, an issue with a doctor who decides to ignore what a computer says and turns out being wrong?
There are lots of legal and ethical issues raised by that question. Is a doctor who ignores the computer in trouble? Is a doctor who uses a computer diagnosis that's wrong in trouble? And so there are so many ethical questions.
So that's healthcare. I want to get into some other industries that are really pertinent for us in central Indiana. But first, let's take a quick break. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ podcast is sponsored by the Office of Minority and Women Business Development, which is committed to serving and certifying businesses owned by minorities, women, veterans, and people with ADA disabilities. The agency helps you access contract opportunities for city, county, municipal, and privately funded projects in central Indiana. For more information, call the office at 317-327-5262 or email at omwbd@indy.gov.
Okay, we're back with the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King. I'm with my compadres, Lesley Weidenbener, Managing Editor, and Anthony Schoettle, Technology Reporter. We're talking about AI and its potential uses and the way it's being used currently in some of the industries that are very important to central Indiana. Can we talk about marketing for a second? I mean, one of the things that we like to say about ourselves is that we're a massive marketing tech hub, and AI is supposed to be a very important part of that. How is that playing out?
I think marketing tech is one of the leading sectors using AI right now. And as one very small example, most people probably don't realize this. When you're chatting with somebody, let's say you go to pick one, Land's End, and you're chatting with an assistant, 8 times out of 10, that's a robot. That's AI. They use pictures of people and make it look as human as possible, but that's AI driven. That's one very small example. But companies here in town, Amarsis, Genesis, certainly Salesforce, are using AI for marketing purposes to understand what people buy and when people buy and how people take in information when they open emails. They use AI to match the right customer with the right person within a company. So they use it as widely as anyone. And that's probably that is only going to grow going forward.
And it makes sense, I think, that that's the area where there's been a lot of use because it is, in relative terms, low stakes. You're not talking about diagnosing anyone's cancer. When you're talking about marketing, you're talking about trying to get people to buy things or to stick with your brand. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that that's where a lot of the experimentation has been, and that's where a lot of the money is in and trying these things out.
On a very simple level, I mean, that's some of the technology employed by the marketing companies is essentially doing what your smart speaker is doing, right? What Alexa is doing is learning from you, learning your likes, dislikes, when you do things, and those sorts of things. And that's what the marketing companies are doing.
And is this also an example of where AI is working in fairly narrow parameters? It's got a lot of data, but it's not trying to, like we say, it's not trying to cure cancer.
It's weird to think of, but as vital as those, as learning somebody's buying habits and when they open emails, those sorts of things aren't nearly as complex. Professor Crandall at IU told me that an AI-driven computer can do that, but teaching an AI-driven bot to stand up, balance itself, read cues, walk across the street and open the door is infinitely more difficult. I mean, I think the time for that is coming, but when you start talking about unlimited sets of social cues and things to read, that's where AI really is struggling right now or falling a bit short. While we're talking about that, the kind of robotic part of AI, I would be remiss if I didn't mention autonomous vehicles, which is an enormous part of this whole conversation. And I interviewed a professor from Indiana University and a professor from Purdue, and they had fairly divergent views on this, whereas the expert from IU thought that we're years away from autonomous vehicles being practical in everyday society. Karthik Kannan up at Purdue thought, he has experience with this. Purdue is doing a lot of work with autonomous vehicles. He feels like that they're going to look very different than the automobiles we drive today. And he doesn't think that we are all that far away, maybe a matter of years away from having true autonomous vehicles that operate. But that is a very complex, people may not be aware, but if you think about driving and all the social cues, think about pulling up to a four-way stop for a moment and how that works. If you pull up to the four-way stop, it's not a real clear-cut set of rules as to who goes and when you go. And if two people pull up at the same time, their human looks at one another and glances, and you recognize what certain things mean to a human. And I'm confident that in time, an AI-driven automobile will be able to read that, but we're not close to that yet.
Also, when I was talking to James McGrath, the Butler professor, about ethics, this is actually one of the areas where he has done the most research, is in autonomous vehicles. And it raises a tremendous amount of questions. And I've got to say, things I had never thought about until I talked to him, and things now that are a little haunting to me. But for example, if you're driving up to an intersection and someone runs out in front of you, and then maybe there's another car coming your way, and then maybe you see a mother pushing a stroller, and then you see another guy, and maybe you recognize him as a guy who committed a crime. When you're driving a car, you don't have time to figure out who to hit and who not to hit and which way to swerve to choose whether or not you save the pregnant woman or the woman with a stroller or whatever. But when you are talking about an autonomous vehicle, that vehicle, because of the speed with which it can do calculations and recognize things, it might actually be able to make those differentiations. And so then what do you do as a programmer? Do you make value judgments about who it hits? Do you decide that the driver or the people in the car are less important to save than the people who are outside of the car crossing the street? Does it decide I will kill the fewest people if I make this move? Those are really tough decisions. But when humans are making programming decisions for an autonomous car, for example, those are the ethical questions that we will eventually be facing.
I hate to bring this back to my dystopian views of the world, but does anybody argue with the idea that a sentient computer will act in its own best interest?
So the ethics professor that I talked to said, you got to think about that. You have to think about the fact that if the technology gets good enough and you create a computer, you create a software program that can think and that can learn and, take care of itself. That's part of the question, the ethical questions about how far that you go. But I think there's no doubt that there is concern that once you put a computer on the path or a software on the path of learning, you lose some control over what it's learning. But as we go along, we might get better and better at figuring out how to do that.
There's no reason the computer couldn't be altruistic either. If we're going to say, well, I refuse to believe that. Every person is looking out for their own self-interest and their own self-interest only. And, you could make a computer as altruistic as any human could be.
Yeah, I think sometimes we bring our own anthropomorphizing biases into imagining what a computer would think. And it is possible that it would think in ways that we just cannot comprehend.
I think that's absolutely true. And again, I think a lot of it goes back to the original programmer as well.
Lesley, what else is in the issue that's exciting?
Well, we didn't want to fill the entire issue with everything about AI, although we really could have. There are quite a few stories about it. But we also have we have a story about embracing failure. We have some profiles of folks who have had failures, entrepreneurs who've had failures and have turned those into wins. We have a great story about Cummins and the way it is both trying to play in the new electric vehicle world while also maintaining its bread and butter work in traditional fuel powertrains and vehicles, buses, work vehicles. And we have an interview with Amy Schumacher, who is the president of the Heritage Group. It's an organization that a lot of people don't know very much about. That they are involved in a lot of very traditional industries, chemicals, asphalt, construction, but they have a lot of innovative things going on, and they recently have started a venture arm where they're spending $50 million a year to foster innovative companies and new technologies. And so they're doing some really interesting things. So it was really great to talk to Amy about some of those things. And then one of the most interesting stories is about hypersonic weapons technology that is being developed at the Crane Naval Installation in southern Indiana, actually in cooperation with Purdue University. There are some very exciting things going on there, and we've got a story about that as well. So we really cover the gamut of innovation going on in Indianapolis here.
And it's weird, for me being a technology reporter to bring this up, but what we cover in the innovation issue isn't just technology. I mean, I think a lot of people think that innovation equals technology, but we cover, innovation in processes, innovation in management, innovations in operations management, all sorts of things. So, innovation happens on many different levels, and some of it has, nothing to do really with technology. It's new innovative ways of doing business.
And I do think that's one of the reasons why I like the failure article so much, is because those things aren't necessarily technology. And, even talking to Amy Schumacher from the Heritage Group, innovation is really about building a culture where people are allowed to fail, where they're allowed to try new ideas, where they're allowed to think outside the box. That's what innovation is really about. Technology assists with a lot of innovation, but the innovation itself is really all about people.
Well, this is awesome, guys. I know this is a major undertaking, and I've been watching you guys work on this for weeks. Thank you so much for the great work.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Anthony and Lesley, who have done a great job letting us know what's in this week's issue. Perhaps you've already taken a gander at the print edition that you have delivered to your home or office. You also can find all of these stories at ibj.com. And remember, if you want unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content, just hit the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Lesley Weidenbener. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.